The morning sun was already beating down hard when Officer Derek Hayes spotted the silver Honda rolling through the stop sign at the corner of Maple and 5th Street. It wasn't a dramatic violation, just one of those lazy stops where the car slowed down but the wheels never quite came to a complete halt. Derek had seen 1,000 of these over his 15 years on the force, and he flipped on his lights without a second thought. The Honda pulled over immediately, which Derek appreciated. At least this driver had the sense to comply without making him chase them down or wait through some ridiculous game of pretend ignorance. He grabbed his ticket book from the passenger seat and stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his belt as he walked up to the driver's side window. The woman behind the wheel was probably in her early 40s, dressed in a navy blue blazer that looked freshly pressed. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and she had the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd already been up for hours. As Derek approached, she was fumbling with her purse, clearly searching for her license and registration. "Good morning, officer," she said, her voice polite but strained. "I know why you stopped me. I'm so sorry about that stop sign back there." Derek leaned down slightly, resting his hand on the roof of her car. "License and registration, please." The woman handed them over quickly, her hands shaking just a little. Derek noticed but didn't comment. People got nervous around cops. That was normal. He took the documents and glanced at them briefly. Everything looked in order, but that didn't change what he'd witnessed. "Ma'am, do you know what the speed limit is in this area?" Derek asked, even though speed wasn't the issue. He liked to start with easy questions, see if people were paying attention to basic traffic laws. "Yes, officer. 25 miles per hour. I wasn't speeding, I promise. It's just that stop sign. I know I should have stopped completely, and I'm truly sorry. I'm running late for something extremely important, and I guess I wasn't as careful as I should have been." Derek straightened up and looked down at her with an expression he'd perfected over the years. It was the look that said he'd heard every excuse in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. "Ma'am, everyone's running late for something. Everyone's got somewhere important to be. If I let every person go just because they told me they had an appointment or a meeting or whatever else, there'd be no point in having traffic laws at all." The woman nodded quickly. "I completely understand, officer. I'm not making excuses. I just wanted you to know that I do recognize what I did wrong." "Do you?" Derek asked, his tone sharpening. "Because from where I was sitting, it looked like you barely even slowed down. That stop sign is there for a reason. There's a crosswalk at that intersection. What if there'd been a pedestrian? What if there'd been a kid on a bike?" "You're absolutely right," the woman said softly. "I should have been more careful." Derek walked back to his patrol car with her documents, taking his time as he ran her information through the system. Clean record. No warrants, not even a parking ticket in the past 5 years. He could have let her off with a warning, but something about her rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the expensive-looking blazer or the way she'd immediately apologized, like saying sorry would somehow make the violation disappear. When he returned to her window, he had his ticket book open and ready. "Ma'am, I'm citing you for failure to stop at a stop sign. The fine is $150 and you'll need to either pay it or appear in court within 30 days. The woman took the ticket, her jaw tightening slightly. "Officer, I really do understand that I made a mistake. But I was wondering if just this once you might consider a warning. I genuinely am running late for something that's incredibly important to my job, and this ticket might actually cause some complications." Derek felt his irritation spike. Here it comes, he thought. The bargaining phase. "Ma'am, let me tell you something. I've been doing this job for 15 years. 15 years of listening to people tell me why they're special, why their situation is different, why I should just let them slide. You know what I've learned? Nobody thinks the rules apply to them. Everyone's got an excuse." "I'm not saying the rules don't apply to me," the woman said, her voice still calm but with a slight edge now. "I'm simply asking if you might show some discretion given that I have a clean record, and this is clearly an isolated incident." "Discretion?" Derek let out a short laugh. "You want discretion? Here's some discretion for you. I could have written you up for reckless driving instead of just a stop sign violation. I could have checked your car for other issues. I'm being plenty discreet by keeping this simple." The woman's face flushed slightly and Derek could see her fighting to keep her composure. Good, he thought. Maybe now she'd understand that batting her eyelashes and asking nicely wasn't going to work. "Officer, I'm a public servant myself, and I have a great deal of respect for law enforcement. I'm not trying to get out of anything I deserve. I'm just asking you to consider the circumstances. A public servant? Derek repeated, his skepticism clear. Let me guess. You work at the DMV? The post office? Actually, I work in the judicial system, the woman said quietly. Derek smirked. Oh yeah, what do you do? Process paperwork? Answer phones? The woman's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. But she took a deep breath and seemed to swallow whatever she'd been about to say. I'd rather not get into specifics right now, officer. But yes, I work in the courts. Well then, you should know better than anyone that laws are laws, Derek said, tapping the ticket book against his palm. You know what? If you've got such a problem with this ticket, you can explain it to the judge. That's what court dates are for. Maybe your connections in the judicial system will help you out. He said the last part with just enough sarcasm to make his point clear. He didn't believe for a second that she had any real position of importance. Court clerk, maybe. Administrative assistant, more likely. People love to inflate their job titles when they thought it might get them out of trouble. The woman stared at him for a long moment, and Derek could practically see her deciding whether to say more or just drop it. Finally, she seemed to choose the latter. Thank you for your time, officer, she said, her voice flat now, all the warmth drained out of it. Drive safely, ma'am, and next time, maybe leave a little earlier so you're not in such a rush. The woman didn't respond to that. She simply placed the ticket on her passenger seat, checked her mirrors carefully, and pulled back into traffic with exaggerated precision. Derek watched her go, feeling satisfied with how he'd handled the situation. Firm but fair, that's what the job required. He climbed back into his patrol car and made a note in his log about the stop. Just another routine traffic violation on just another Tuesday morning. He had no way of knowing that this particular stop, and the way he'd conducted himself during it, was about to come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. As he pulled back onto his patrol route, Derek was already thinking about lunch and whether he'd have time to grab something decent or if he'd be stuck with another gas station sandwich. The woman in the Honda was already forgotten. Just another face in an endless parade of drivers who thought they were too important to follow the rules. He had no idea that in just a few weeks, that same face would be looking down at him from a very different position, and the smug confidence he felt right now would crumble into dust. 3 weeks had passed since the traffic stop, and Derek Hayes had completely forgotten about the woman in the Honda. He'd written dozens of tickets since then, testified in court multiple times, and dealt with everything from fender benders to domestic disputes. One rolling stop on a Tuesday morning wasn't exactly the kind of thing that stuck in his memory. Today was another routine court day. Derek hated court days, but they were part of the job. He'd show up, testify about whatever traffic violations he'd cited, and usually the judge would side with him. It was mostly a formality. People rarely fought their tickets, and when they did, they almost never won. He walked into the municipal courthouse a little after 9 in the morning, his uniform crisp and his boots polished. The waiting area outside the courtrooms was already packed with people. Some looked nervous, others annoyed, and a few seemed completely lost. Derek recognized a couple of other officers milling around, comparing notes and trading stories about their latest calls. As he scanned the crowd, looking for a place to stand, his eyes landed on a familiar face. It took him a second to place her, but then it clicked. The woman from the Honda, the one who'd claimed she worked in the judicial system. She was sitting by herself near the back wall, dressed in another one of those neat blazers, this time in charcoal gray. She had a folder open on her lap and seemed to be reading through some papers. Derek felt a grin spread across his face. So she'd decided to fight the ticket after all. This was going to be easier than he thought. He had his notes. He had a clear memory of the violation, and he had 15 years of credibility behind him. What did she have? A claim that she was running late and some vague story about working in the courts. He walked over to where she was sitting, his boots clicking against the tile floor. When he got close enough, he cleared his throat loudly. Well, look who decided to show up. The woman looked up from her papers, and Derek saw recognition flash in her eyes. She didn't smile. Officer Hayes, she said simply, her tone neutral. So you're actually going through with this, huh? Gonna try to fight a clear-cut traffic violation? Derek said, loud enough that several people nearby turned to look. Let me save you some time. I've got dash cam footage. I've got my notes. I've got 15 years of experience. You rolled through that stop sign and the judge is going to agree with me. The woman closed her folder slowly and looked up at him. Officer, I'm not here to cause any problems. I'm just exercising my right to have my day in court. Your day in court, Derek repeated, shaking his head. You know how many people say that. And you know how many of them actually win? Maybe 1 in 50. And that's being generous. A younger officer Derek knew named Rodriguez walked by and caught the tail end of the conversation. He stopped and glanced between Derek and the woman. What's going on here? Rodriguez asked. Derek jerked his thumb toward the woman. This lady thinks she can beat a stop sign violation. Told me 3 weeks ago that she works in the judicial system. Like that's supposed to impress me. I never said it was supposed to impress you, the woman said quietly. I was simply stating a fact. A fact, Derek said with a laugh. Right, so what do you do? File papers? Answer phones at the clerk's office? The woman's jaw tightened, but she didn't answer. Derek took her silence as confirmation. That's what I thought, he said. Look, I'm not trying to be a jerk here, but you need to understand something. Just because you work in a courthouse doesn't mean you get special treatment. If anything, you should know better. You should know that when you break the law, there are consequences. I do know that, the woman said, her voice still calm but with an edge to it now. I'm very aware of how the legal system works. Then why are we here? Why waste everyone's time with this? The woman stood up and Derek realized she was taller than he'd thought. She looked him directly in the eye. Because I have the right to contest any citation I receive. That's how the system works, officer. You might not like it, but that's the law. Derek felt his irritation spike. Who did this woman think she was, lecturing him about the law? You know what your problem is? Derek said, his voice rising slightly. You're one of those people who thinks rules are for everyone else. You think because you work in a courthouse, because you wear nice clothes and talk proper, that somehow you're above getting a ticket. Well, newsflash, lady, you're not. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Other defendants waiting for their cases were watching the exchange with interest. A couple of officers had drifted over to see what the commotion was about. Even a bailiff near the courtroom door was paying attention. The woman glanced around at all the watching faces, and Derek could see a flush creeping up her neck. Good, maybe she was finally getting the message. Officer Hayes, she said, her voice lower now. I'm not claiming to be above anything. I made a mistake, and I'm here to address it through the proper channels. I would appreciate it if you would treat me with the same basic respect you'd show any other citizen. Respect? Derek let out a short laugh. I'll tell you about respect. Respect is stopping at stop signs. Respect is not wasting taxpayer money by clogging up the court system, because you can't accept responsibility for your actions. Respect is not throwing around claims about working in the judicial system like it's some kind of magic password. Rodriguez touched Derek's arm. Hey man, maybe dial it back a little. Derek shrugged him off. No, she needs to hear this. People need to hear this. You know how many times a day I deal with people who think they're special? Who think their job or their status or whatever means they shouldn't have to follow the same rules as everyone else? The woman gathered her folder and her purse, clearly done with the conversation. I'm not going to engage with this anymore, officer. I'll see you in the courtroom. Yeah, you will, Derek called after her as she walked away. And I'll see you walking out of here with that ticket upheld and probably an attitude adjustment to go with it. She didn't turn around or respond. She just kept walking until she found an empty seat on the other side of the waiting area, as far from Derek as she could get. Rodriguez shook his head. Dude, that was kind of harsh, don't you think? Harsh? I was being honest. That's the problem with people these days. Nobody wants to hear the truth anymore. Still, man, you don't know anything about her. Maybe she really does have an important job. Derek waved that away. Trust me, if she had an important job, she wouldn't be sitting here fighting a $150 ticket. She'd have just paid it and moved on. The bailiff who'd been watching the exchange caught Derek's eye and gave him a look that was hard to read. It wasn't quite disapproval, but it wasn't approval either. Derek ignored it. The bailiff was probably friends with the woman or something. People who worked in courthouses always stuck together. As the morning wore on and they waited for their cases to be called, Derek caught several people glancing between him and the woman. Some of them whispered to each other. Derek didn't care. He'd been a cop long enough to know that people were always going to judge and criticize. It came with the territory. What Derek didn't notice was the way some of the courthouse staff looked at him when they walked by. He didn't catch the barely concealed smirks or the knowing glances they exchanged with each other. He didn't see the way the bailiff quietly spoke to another court employee and nodded in his direction. He was too busy congratulating himself on putting an entitled citizen in her place to notice any of that when a clerk finally came out and started calling people into the courtroom. Derek grabbed his folder and headed for the door. He walked past the woman one more time and he couldn't resist one final comment. "Hope you're ready to lose," he said under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. The woman looked up at him, and for just a second, Derek could have sworn he saw something in her eyes. Not anger, not fear, something else. Something that almost looked like pity, but that didn't make any sense, so Derek shrugged it off and walked into the courtroom, ready to do what he'd done 100 times before. He had no idea that in the next few minutes his entire world was about to flip upside down. The courtroom was exactly what you'd expect from a municipal court. Wooden benches lined up in rows, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and that particular smell of old building and nervous people that seemed to exist in every courthouse in America. Derek walked in with the confidence of someone who'd been through this routine countless times. He took his usual spot near the front, where the officers typically sat. Rodriguez followed him in, along with 2 other cops who had cases on the docket that day. The courtroom was filling up quickly with defendants, lawyers, and various court staff members moving around with folders and files. Derek pulled out his notes about the stop sign violation and reviewed them one more time. Everything was solid. Time, date, location, clear observation of the violation. He'd even noted the weather conditions that day. Sunny, clear visibility, no obstructions. There was no way this woman was going to win. The bailiff walked to the front of the courtroom and stood near the judge's bench. He was an older guy, probably close to retirement, with gray hair and a weathered face that suggested he'd seen everything at least twice. He cleared his throat to get everyone's attention. "All right, folks, we're going to get started in just a minute here. Just want to let everyone know that Judge Patterson retired last week due to some health issues, so we've got someone new on the bench today. Please show them the same respect you'd show any judge in this courtroom." Derek barely registered the announcement. He'd appeared before dozens of different judges over the years. They were all pretty much the same. Some were stricter than others, but they all generally deferred to police testimony in straightforward traffic cases. "Also," the bailiff continued, "I want to remind everyone that this is a court of law. We expect professional behavior from everyone in this room. That includes officers, attorneys, defendants, and spectators. Any outbursts or disrespectful conduct will not be tolerated." The bailiff looked directly at Derek when he said that last part, and Derek felt a flash of irritation. What was that about? Was the old guy still hung up on the conversation in the waiting area? Derek hadn't done anything wrong. He'd just been honest with someone who needed to hear the truth. "All rise," the bailiff called out suddenly, his voice taking on that formal tone they all used. "The municipal court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Catherine Chen presiding." Everyone in the courtroom stood up, the sound of shuffling feet and rustling papers filling the air. Derek stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the door behind the bench where the judge would enter. The door opened, and Derek's heart stopped. Walking through that door, wearing the black robes of a judge, was the woman from the Honda, the woman he'd given a ticket to 3 weeks ago, the woman he'd just humiliated in the waiting area not 20 minutes earlier. Derek felt the blood drain from his face. His mouth went dry. His carefully organized notes suddenly felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds in his hands. No, this couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of mistake, but there was no mistake. The woman, Judge Chen, apparently walked to the bench with calm, measured steps. She sat down, arranged some papers in front of her, and finally looked out at the courtroom. Her eyes swept across the assembled crowd, and when they landed on Derek, they paused for just a fraction of a second. Her expression didn't change. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just looked at him with the same neutral, professional gaze she was giving everyone else. Derek heard Rodriguez whisper beside him, "Dude, isn't that the woman you were just talking to outside?" Derek couldn't respond. His tongue felt stuck to the roof of his mouth. "Please be seated," Judge Chen said, her voice clear and authoritative. Everyone sat, but Derek practically fell into his seat. His mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. The woman who'd said she worked in the judicial system hadn't been exaggerating or inflating her position. She was a judge, an actual judge, and he'd just spent the last 3 weeks dismissing her, mocking her, and treating her like she was nobody. The bailiff handed Judge Chen a file and she opened it, scanning the contents quickly. "Thank you all for being here today," she began. "As some of you may have heard, I'm new to this bench. I was sworn in 2 weeks ago after serving in another jurisdiction, and I'm looking forward to serving this community with fairness and integrity." 2 weeks ago, Derek's mind flashed back to the traffic stop. She'd said she was running late for something incredibly important. She'd been on her way to her swearing-in ceremony, to become a judge, and he'd treated her like she was making up excuses. "Now," Judge Chen continued, "I want to be clear about something from the start. This courtroom will operate with respect and professionalism at all times. I expect that from the attorneys, from the defendants, from the court staff, and from law enforcement officers. We're all here to ensure that justice is served fairly, and that everyone receives the treatment they deserve under the law." Was Derek imagining it? Or did her eyes linger on him again when she said that last part? The morning proceeded with several cases before Derek's. Judge Chen handled each one with careful attention, asking questions, reviewing evidence, and making rulings that seemed measured and fair. Derek watched her work, and with each passing minute he felt sicker and sicker. She wasn't just some clerk or administrative assistant. She was sharp, knowledgeable, and clearly experienced. The attorneys who appeared before her treated her with genuine respect, not the fake politeness people sometimes gave to authority figures. This was someone who'd earned her position, and Derek had talked down to her like she was a child. Rodriguez leaned over and whispered, "Man, you really stepped in it this time." Derek didn't respond. What could he say? Rodriguez was right. He'd stepped in it. He'd stepped in it so badly that he couldn't even see a way out. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, the bailiff called Derek's case number. "Traffic citation for failure to stop at a stop sign," the bailiff announced. "Officer Derek Hayes citing." Derek stood up, his legs feeling unsteady. He walked to the front of the courtroom, very aware that every eye was on him. He could feel the other officers watching. He could feel the defendants watching. Most of all, he could feel Judge Chen watching. When he reached the witness stand, the bailiff had him raise his right hand. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do," Derek managed, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. Judge Chen was looking down at the file in front of her. "Officer Hayes, I see here that you cited a vehicle for failing to stop at a stop sign at the intersection of Maple and 5th Street on the morning of September 21st. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you're prepared to testify about what you observed that day?" "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Chen looked up at him then, and Derek felt himself shrink under her gaze. There was no anger there, no vindictiveness, just a calm professional assessment that somehow made him feel even worse. "Officer Hayes, before we proceed, I need to make something clear to everyone in this courtroom." She turned slightly to address the whole room. "The defendant in this case is myself. I was the driver of the vehicle that Officer Hayes cited that morning." There was a collective murmur from the spectators. The other officers exchanged glances. Rodriguez's eyes went wide. Judge Chen continued, "Given that I am personally involved in this case, I cannot preside over it. That would be a clear conflict of interest and a violation of judicial ethics. Therefore, I'm recusing myself from this matter, and it will be reassigned to Judge Morrison in courtroom 3. She made a note in her file and set it aside. "However," she said, and Derek's stomach dropped at that single word, "Officer Hayes is also the citing officer in several other cases on today's docket, cases in which I am not personally involved. Those cases will proceed as scheduled." Derek felt sweat forming on his forehead. He understood what was happening now. She couldn't hear her own case, but she could absolutely hear the others. And she would be evaluating his testimony, his procedures, his professionalism. Judge Chen looked directly at him. "Officer Hayes, I'm sure you understand the importance of conducting yourself with integrity and professionalism at all times, both in the field and in the courtroom. I'm sure you also understand that every person who appears in this court, regardless of their background or circumstances, deserves to be treated with basic human dignity and respect." "Yes, Your Honor," Derek said quietly. "Good, then let's proceed with the next case. You may step down for now, but please remain available. I believe you're the citing officer in case number 4739 as well? Yes, Your Honor. We'll call that one shortly. As Derek walked back to his seat, he felt like everyone in the courtroom was staring at him. And they probably were. The officer who'd made a fool of himself by disrespecting a judge. The cop who'd been so sure of himself that he hadn't bothered to listen when someone tried to tell him who they were. Rodriguez wouldn't look at him. The other officers suddenly seemed very interested in their own paperwork. Derek sat down and tried to make himself as small as possible. The morning had just started, and he already knew it was going to be the longest day of his career. The next case was called, and Derek watched as a young man in his 20s approached the bench. He looked nervous, fidgeting with his tie and glancing around the courtroom like he wasn't sure he was in the right place. The bailiff read the charge. Speeding, 15 miles over the limit in a school zone. The same officer who'd been standing near Derek earlier, a guy named Thompson, stood up to give his testimony. Derek had known Thompson for about 6 years. Good officer, straightforward, no nonsense. This should be simple. Thompson took the stand and was sworn in. Judge Chen reviewed the file in front of her, then looked up at the officer. Officer Thompson, can you walk me through what you observed on the day in question? Yes, Your Honor. I was stationed near Jefferson Elementary at approximately 2:45 in the afternoon. School was letting out, and I was monitoring traffic in the school zone. I observed the defendant's vehicle traveling at approximately 40 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour school zone. And how did you determine the vehicle's speed? I used my radar gun, Your Honor. It's department-issued and calibrated regularly. Judge Chen nodded. When was the last calibration performed on that radar gun? Thompson hesitated. I'd have to check the exact date, Your Honor. Please do. Thompson pulled out his notes and flipped through them. Derek could see his colleague starting to sweat a little. This wasn't a question judges usually asked. Most of them just took the officer's word for it. It looks like it was calibrated about 8 months ago, Your Honor. 8 months, Judge Chen repeated. And what is the department policy on radar gun calibration? Thompson shifted his weight. I believe it's supposed to be every 6 months, Your Honor. You believe or you know? It's every 6 months, Your Honor. Judge Chen made a note. So the radar gun you used to clock the defendant's speed was 2 months past its calibration date? Yes, Your Honor, but I can assure you it was working properly. I tested at the beginning of every shift. I'm sure you do, Officer Thompson. But testing it yourself and having it professionally calibrated are two different things, wouldn't you agree? Thompson looked uncomfortable. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Chen turned her attention to the young defendant. Sir, do you have anything you'd like to say regarding this citation? The young man stood up quickly. Your Honor, I'm not saying I wasn't speeding. I might have been going a little fast. But I just started a new job and I was running late and I wasn't thinking about the school zone. I'm really sorry. I don't have any other tickets. I'm a safe driver. I appreciate your honesty, Judge Chen said. She looked back at Officer Thompson. Officer, were there children present in the area when you observed the defendant's vehicle? School was letting out, Your Honor, so yes, there were children in the vicinity. In the vicinity or in immediate danger from the defendant's vehicle? Thompson paused. In the vicinity, Your Honor, not directly in the path of the vehicle. Judge Chen leaned back in her chair, considering. Derek watched her carefully, trying to figure out where she was going with this. Here's my concern, Judge Chen said. We have a radar gun that was past its calibration date. We have a defendant who admits he may have been speeding, but maintains he's otherwise a safe driver with a clean record. And while I take school zone violations very seriously, I also have to ensure that the evidence presented meets the standard required for a conviction. She looked at Thompson. Officer, I'm not questioning your integrity or your observations, but the fact remains that the equipment you used to measure the defendant's speed was not in compliance with department policy. That creates reasonable doubt about the accuracy of the measurement. Derek felt his stomach sink. He knew what was coming. I'm dismissing this case, Judge Chen announced. However, sir, she turned to the young defendant, let this be a wake-up call. School zones exist for a reason. Those speed limits protect children. If you ever find yourself before me again on a similar charge, you won't get the same consideration. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor. Thank you, Your Honor. I promise I'll be more careful. See that you are. Case dismissed. Thompson stepped down from the witness stand, his face red. As he walked past Derek, he muttered under his breath, Great, just great. The bailiff called the next case. This one was Derek's. A woman in her 50s who'd been cited for running a red light. Derek had been absolutely certain about this one when he wrote the ticket. The light had been red for at least 3 seconds before she entered the intersection. Derek took the stand again, and this time his hands were shaking slightly as he was sworn in. He could feel Judge Chen's eyes on him, and it took everything he had to meet her gaze. "Officer Hayes," Judge Chen began, "please describe what you observed on the day you cited the defendant." Derek cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor. I was positioned at the intersection of Oak and 7th Street at approximately 11:15 in the morning. I observed the defendant's vehicle enter the intersection after the traffic signal had turned red. How long had the light been red? Approximately 3 seconds, Your Honor. And where were you positioned when you made this observation?" Derek had answered questions like this 100 times, but suddenly he felt uncertain. "I was in my patrol car pulled into a parking lot on the northeast corner of the intersection. So you had a clear view of both the traffic signal and the defendant's vehicle?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you're certain the light was red when the vehicle entered the intersection?" "Absolutely certain, Your Honor." Judge Chen picked up another sheet of paper from her file. "Officer Hayes, I have here your incident report from that day. In it, you note that you observed the violation and immediately activated your lights to conduct the traffic stop. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And how long would you say elapsed between when you observed the violation and when you activated your lights?" Derek thought back. "Maybe 2 or 3 seconds, Your Honor." 2 or 3 seconds. "And in your report, you note that you had to wait for traffic to clear before you could pull out of the parking lot to pursue the vehicle. How long did that take?" Derek felt a bead of sweat roll down his back. "I'm not sure exactly, Your Honor. Maybe 10 or 15 seconds. 10 or 15 seconds, Judge Chen repeated. "So from the time you observed the alleged violation to the time you were actually able to pursue the vehicle, approximately 15 to 20 seconds elapsed?" "That sounds about right, Your Honor." Judge Chen turned to the defendant. "Ma'am, what do you remember about that day?" The woman stood up, wringing her hands. "Your Honor, I remember the light turning yellow as I approached the intersection. I was already committed to going through. I didn't think I could stop safely. I honestly thought I made it through before it turned red." Judge Chen nodded. "Officer Hayes, is it possible that the defendant entered the intersection on yellow and you observed the red light after she'd already committed to proceeding through?" Derek wanted to say no. He wanted to insist that he was right, that his observation was correct. But with Judge Chen looking at him with those calm, assessing eyes, he found himself thinking back to that day more carefully. "I suppose it's possible." "Your Honor," he admitted quietly. "You suppose, or it is possible?" "It's possible, Your Honor." Judge Chen made another note. "Officer Hayes, I'm not suggesting you were deliberately inaccurate in your report. But I am concerned about the timing here. 15 to 20 seconds is a long time in traffic. Colors change. Circumstances shift, and the defendant's account is plausible." She looked at the woman. "Ma'am, I'm dismissing this citation. However, I want you to be more cautious at intersections in the future. If you're approaching a yellow light and you're not sure you can make it through safely, the right choice is to stop." "Yes, Your Honor. Thank you so much." As Derek stepped down, he felt completely deflated. 2 cases, 2 dismissals, and he knew there were still more to come. Judge Chen wasn't being unfair or vindictive. She wasn't throwing out cases just to get back at him. She was simply doing what judges were supposed to do, examining the evidence carefully, asking hard questions, making sure everything held up to scrutiny. The problem was, Derek had gotten lazy. He'd gotten comfortable. He'd been doing this job for so long that he'd stopped double-checking himself, stopped questioning his own observations, stopped making sure every single detail was bulletproof. The next case was called. Another one of Derek's citations, this time for an expired registration. Derek took the stand once more, and Judge Chen asked him to describe the violation. "I observed that the registration sticker on the defendant's license plate had expired," Derek said. "And did you verify this through your computer system before issuing the citation?" Derek froze. He was supposed to verify. It was standard procedure, but he'd been so sure based on the sticker that he'd just written the ticket. "No, Your Honor. I issued the citation based on my visual observation of the expired sticker." Judge Chen turned to the defendant, an elderly man who looked confused and worried. Sir, what's your understanding of your vehicle registration? The man stood up slowly. Your Honor, I renewed my registration online. They told me the new sticker would come in the mail, but it never arrived. I've been meaning to go down to the DMV to get a replacement, but I haven't had a chance yet. Do you have proof of your online renewal? Yes, Your Honor. I brought the email confirmation. He handed a printed paper to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Chen. She reviewed it carefully. This shows that your registration was renewed the week before Officer Hayes issued your citation. The registration is current. You simply haven't received the physical sticker yet. She looked at Derek. Officer Hayes, if you had taken 30 seconds to verify the registration through your computer system, you would have seen that it was current. Instead, you issued a citation based solely on a missing sticker, which caused this gentleman unnecessary stress and required him to take time off to come to court today. Derek felt about 2 inches tall. I apologize, Your Honor. Your apology is noted. Case dismissed. By the time the morning session ended, Judge Chen had dismissed 4 out of Derek's 6 cases. The only 2 that stood were ones where his documentation was absolutely perfect, and his procedures had been followed to the letter. As people filed out of the courtroom, Derek remained in his seat staring at the floor. Rodriguez stopped next to him. You okay, man? Derek shook his head. No, I'm really not. The news spread through the police department like wildfire. By the time Derek got back to the station that afternoon, it seemed like everyone had already heard what happened. Officers who normally greeted him with a nod or a joke suddenly found reasons to look the other way. A couple of the younger cops whispered to each other as he walked past, then quickly went quiet. Derek went straight to his locker, changed out of his uniform, and sat down on the bench with his head in his hands. He'd never felt so embarrassed in his entire career. 15 years on the force, and in one morning he'd been made to look like a rookie who didn't know the first thing about proper procedure. The worst part was, he couldn't even be angry about it. Judge Chen had been completely fair. She hadn't yelled at him or humiliated him publicly. She'd simply asked reasonable questions and pointed out the gaps in his work. If anything, that made it worse. If she'd been cruel or vindictive, at least he could have blamed her. But she'd done nothing wrong. The fault was entirely his. Hayes. The voice came from behind him. Derek looked up to see Captain Morrison standing in the doorway of the locker room. The captain was a no-nonsense guy in his late 50s, who'd worked his way up from patrol officer to commander of their precinct. He didn't look happy. My office. Now. Derek followed the captain through the station, past the desks where other officers were typing reports or talking on phones. Every person they passed seemed to watch them go by. The walk to Morrison's office felt like it took an hour. Morrison closed the door behind them and gestured to a chair. Derek sat down while the captain walked around to his desk and dropped into his own chair with a heavy sigh. Do you want to tell me what happened in court today? Morrison asked. Derek had been dreading this conversation, but he knew he had to face it. I made some mistakes, sir. Judge Chen found problems with several of my citations. Procedures I didn't follow, details I didn't verify. She dismissed most of my cases. Most of them, Morrison repeated. Hayes, do you have any idea how this makes our department? Look, do you know what kind of message this sends to the community? Yes, sir, I know. And I take full responsibility. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Derek for a long moment. I got a call from the courthouse this afternoon. Not from Judge Chen herself, but from the court administrator. Apparently your behavior toward the judge before court started was witnessed by several people. You want to tell me about that? Derek felt his face burn with shame. I didn't know who she was, sir. I'd given her a traffic citation 3 weeks ago, and when I saw her in the courthouse waiting area, I thought she was just a regular citizen fighting her ticket. I may have been disrespectful in how I spoke to her. May have been. Morrison's eyebrows went up. According to what I heard, you were condescending, dismissive, and you publicly questioned her integrity in front of a room full of people. That's accurate. Sir? Morrison rubbed his temples like he was getting a headache. Hayes, you've been a good officer for a long time, but something's changed. You've gotten comfortable, too comfortable. You're cutting corners, not following proper procedure, and worst of all, you're treating people like they're beneath you. I know, sir. You're right. I'm putting you on administrative duty for the next 2 weeks. You'll work the desk, handle paperwork, and most importantly, you're going to attend some mandatory training sessions. Community relations, proper citation procedures, and professional conduct. After that, we'll evaluate whether you're ready to go back on patrol." Derek nodded. He'd expected something like this. "I understand, sir. And Hayes, if I ever hear about you treating anyone, and I mean anyone, with that kind of disrespect again, you'll be looking for a new job. I don't care if they're a judge or a homeless person on the street. Everyone deserves basic human dignity. We're public servants. The public part matters." "Got it. Yes, sir. I've got it." The next 2 weeks were the longest of Derek's life. Working the front desk at the station was mind-numbing. He answered phones, filed paperwork, and dealt with people coming in to pay fines or file reports. The training sessions were even worse, not because they were difficult, but because they forced Derek to confront just how far he'd drifted from the officer he'd meant to be when he first put on the uniform. In the community relations class, the instructor talked about the importance of treating every interaction as an opportunity to build trust. Derek thought about the woman in the Honda, trying to explain that she had somewhere important to be, and how he'd dismissed her without a second thought. In the procedures class, they went over proper documentation standards. Derek realized he'd been taking shortcuts for years, relying on his experience instead of actually doing the work correctly. But it was the professional conduct class that hit hardest. The instructor, a retired lieutenant, talked about how power could corrupt even good people if they weren't careful. How easy it was to start seeing yourself as above the people you were supposed to serve. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone else," the instructor said. "It makes you responsible to everyone else. The moment you forget that, you've lost your way." Derek knew he'd lost his way. He'd been so focused on being right, on being the authority, that he'd forgotten why he'd become a cop in the first place. He'd wanted to help people, to make his community safer, to be someone people could trust. Instead, he'd become someone people probably dreaded dealing with. 3 weeks after the courthouse incident, Derek was finally cleared to return to patrol. His first day back, he drove past the intersection of Maple and 5th Street where he'd pulled over Judge Chen. He thought about that morning and how different things might have been if he'd just listened to her, treated her with basic respect, taken a moment to actually see her as a person instead of just another violation to write up. Over the next several months, Derek made a conscious effort to change. When he pulled someone over, he introduced himself politely and actually listened to what they had to say. When he wrote a citation, he made absolutely sure his procedures were correct and his documentation was thorough. When someone was having a bad day and got snippy with him, instead of responding with attitude, he tried to remember that everyone was fighting battles he knew nothing about. It wasn't always easy. There were days when his old habits tried to resurface, when he wanted to fall back into that comfortable superiority he'd worn like armor for so long. But then he'd remember the feeling of sitting in that courtroom, watching his cases get dismissed one after another, and knowing that he'd brought it all on himself. About 6 months after the incident, Derek was at the courthouse again for a different case. He was walking through the hallway when he saw Judge Chen coming from the opposite direction. His heart started pounding. He'd been dreading this moment, wondering if he'd ever have to face her again. As they got closer, Derek knew he had to say something. He couldn't just walk past her and pretend nothing had happened. He stopped and she stopped, and for a moment they just looked at each other. "Your Honor," Derek said, his voice quiet, "I owe you an apology. The way I treated you, both during that traffic stop and at the courthouse, was completely unprofessional and disrespectful. There's no excuse for my behavior. I'm sorry." Judge Chen studied him for a moment, and Derek couldn't read her expression. Then slowly she nodded. "Officer Hayes, I appreciate your apology. I could tell that day in court was difficult for you, but not because of anything I did to you. It was difficult because you had to confront some hard truths about yourself. That kind of self-reflection is never easy, but it's necessary if we want to grow." "You were more than fair with me," Derek said. "You had every right to file a complaint or make a bigger deal out of how I treated you, but you didn't. You just did your job and you did it well. That actually made it harder for me, but it also taught me more than any complaint would have." "That's good to hear," Judge Chen said. "You know, Officer Hayes, I've been watching the cases you've brought before my court since then. Your documentation has been excellent. Your procedures have been thorough, and I've heard from some of the defendants that you treated them with respect during their interactions with you. That tells me you took the lesson to heart." Derek felt a weight lift off his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. I'm trying, Your Honor. Every day I'm trying to be the kind of officer people can trust and respect. That's all any of us can do, Judge Chen said. Learn from our mistakes and try to do better. We are both public servants, Officer Hayes. We both have the power to affect people's lives for better or worse. The question is which one we choose. I'm choosing better, Derek said. I promise you that, Judge Chen smiled, the first real smile he'd ever seen from her. Then I'd say we're both doing our jobs. Take care, Officer Hayes. You too, Your Honor. As Derek watched her walk away, he thought about how one moment of humiliation had changed his entire career, maybe even his entire life. He'd been so sure of himself, so confident in his authority, that he'd forgotten the most important part of being a police officer. It wasn't about power or control or being right. It was about service. It was about treating every person with dignity, whether they were a judge or someone having the worst day of their life. Derek walked back to his patrol car with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He had a long shift ahead of him, and he was going to spend every minute of it trying to be the officer his community deserved. Not perfect, but better. Always trying to be better, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough.